Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. I am so thrilled that you are joining us today. If you've been a long-term listener of the podcast, you know that we talk a lot about social justice, which is the vehicle by which we achieve equitable outcomes. And today we are going to talk about social justice as a framework for equity in education. My guest today is Dr. Charles Barrett. He's a district level administrator in Virginia, practiced as a school psychologist for 13 years at the elementary and secondary levels, and serves as an adjunct lecturer at several universities where he's actively involved in the training and development of future school psychologists. Dr. Barrett knows that significant contextual factors, events happening around students, can affect their social, emotional, and behavioral functioning. He joins me today to discuss actionable steps that parents, educators, and practitioners can take to promote positive outcomes for all students and communities.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Dr. Barrett, so glad to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
You have an extensive background. I mean, you're a school psychologist, you're an educator, an author, a speaker. I'm so thrilled to have you on the podcast to talk about social justice. I did an intro to this episode before you joined, and so provided a little bit of information about the topic. But I'd love for you to kind of share before we jump into, this issue, this very important issue, how you got into this particular area from your background.
As you said, I'm a school psychologist. As of now, I've been one for 15 years. So I've served elementary school, high school, middle school, all ages, and love my work. And I still identify as a school psychologist. And all that I do in my teaching and my writing. And social justice, kind of how I got into it was, it was something that was not talked about explicitly in my training as a school psychologist. But I started to think about all of these issues that happen around children that have significant implications for their functioning. So for their academic functioning, for their social, emotional, behavioral functioning. And these are things that are not the fault of any one person or can be changed easily by one person, but they're nonetheless significant. They're important for us to understand, whether we're educators or we're teachers, administrators, psychologists, or other mental health providers. And it's things like access to quality instruction, or how do we fund public schools, or kids attending schools in safe and supportive learning environments. All of these variables or these realities have implications for how children perform and how they do in school. So I wanted to talk about how we as a system, as educators, as people, can really be more mindful of these realities and start to shift those systems to really promote more positive outcomes for young people.
Wonderful. And social justice really is about how systems and structures differentially affect people based
Exactly
on
right.
their identity. And those systems and structures can lead to very different outcomes for students, depending on the level of support that they're getting. And that really speaks to kind of what we do on this podcast, because not everybody has equal access to what it is that they need in order to reach their full potential in terms of students.
Exactly right. You've shared so many wonderful things, even in that short comment. And I think that at the core of social justice are two words: access and opportunity. Who has it and who does not? and what lack of access and opportunity does to the outcomes that children experience over time. So that, and also this idea of systems and structures that happen, again, around children, communities, could be legislation, all these things that really affect people based on their identity. So all of it is so important. And what I wanted to do in the book is really to break down these concepts in ways that everyone could understand, no matter your background as an educator or a graduate student, a parent, a layperson, to really use stories and to use really concrete examples of how these realities really affect children in school, and what we can do about that.
Right. And it's multi-level in terms of the factors. You talk in your book about those significant contextual factors, all of those events happening around students. It's their family, it's their community, it's the school that they're in, it's the school district that they're in.
Exactly right.
There's so many factors playing a role. And when we think about that, some people can kind of throw their hands up and say there's so many things that, again, are playing a role.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we even begin in terms of, first understanding social justice, but understanding how do we move from knowledge to action?
Correct. So, yes, I do think it starts with just some basic level of awareness that these things are real. And I don't want to assume that everyone believes that. Even some teachers, some principals, some psychologists don't believe that these realities, these structures are really meaningful for child outcomes. So I think after we've just raised some basic awareness, I do think there's concrete action regardless of your roles. Even as a practicing psychologist, I think it's how do I think about making decisions about disability? As a parent, it's how do I advocate for my child so they're getting what they need in their respective school or school district. So everyone really has a part to play in promoting these socially just principles that really lead to equitable outcomes for all children and all young people.
Right. And for people listening who might be hearing structures, right, and systems,
Yeah.
can you give some concrete examples of what that might look like in terms of having inequitable access, which can result in inequitable outcomes?
Sure. So I think a major one in this country is certainly school funding as a system. So how do we allocate resources to schools in different communities? So I think about the system or the structure of redlining, for example, historically, where if you were from a minoritized background, you were a Black family, you were a Jewish family sometimes, or another minoritized group, you were not able to purchase a home in a certain part of a city or a community. Those areas were typically not invested in, so lower property value. And then when we build schools in these parts of cities, the tax revenue, the tax base from that home or those homes are a lot lower than homes in other parts of the city. Now, from tax revenue, we get money to hire highly qualified teachers, money for technology and books and other resources that really promote the quality of education that we can give students attending those schools. So for a lot of our minoritized students in different parts of the country, they don't receive the same quality of education given where they're living and all the other larger realities, policy, structures, systems. So I think about legislation that made that legal until 1968, until the Fair Housing Act. That was okay in this country. So that is an example of a system, of a structure that systematically disenfranchised certain people from various minoritized or marginalized backgrounds. So the school funding one is huge. Another significant one in this country is racism, and the reality of how pervasive racism is in every institution: education, housing, banking and finance, healthcare. And because of that, we do experience differential outcomes across groups. COVID-19 was a global pandemic, a global event, but depending on your background, you experience effects or consequences of that very differently. If you had access to good health care, you might have survived differently than if you did not have access. If you were a person in good health for a variety of reasons, you had differential outcomes, again, um, based on those realities. So I think racism as a system, as a structure, how we fund public schools, all those things are just examples of what's happening around people that really leads to outcomes that they experience.
And those are so significant, and those are not new issues,
Sure.
right? When we think about, all of the disparities that you talked about in healthcare, financing, housing, those those are persistent. They have existed and they continue to exist. And we see the disparities in education. And you mentioned COVID. And we saw it significantly during that time in terms of access, who was able to easily transition to remote learning during that time, who was able to provide students with computers or Chromebooks and access to educators. There were disparities in that. And we are seeing the outcomes of COVID still. It's 2 years for many students who had disruption, significant disruption in their educational experience. And that was not the same for all students across the country in terms of how much that disruption impacted their learning. And if you were also a student who had learning difficulties or emerging learning difficulties that may or not have been identified at that time, then you also struggled to a more significant degree than your peers who did not, who may have had access or greater access to support and resources.
Absolutely. I know that a large part of many, in my training as a school psychologist, a large part of it has always been identifying students that were disabled or had disabilities and then require more specialized support than IEP or special education. And one of the things that I've always been concerned about, but even more so now, is that we're not misidentifying students as disabled when it really is a function of lack of opportunity and access to meaningful instruction. So although the kid looks like they're underperforming or underachieving, what was their opportunity to really benefit from effective instruction through virtual learning, distance learning, through having an iPad or a Chromebook or Wi-Fi access? And if they did have those things, were there people available to support them if they were struggling? Were parents essential workers? And all those realities that, again, students experience to different degrees depending on family circumstance. So I never want us to label or mislabel students because their functioning looks like a disability when it could be a host of other factors, again, going on around them. And those are the things that I really want to highlight that we must take a closer look at before we identify the difficulty being within the person themselves.
Absolutely. And you first have to realize that it was an issue, because if you believe that, well, we're in post-pandemic era right now, and so everybody, should have caught up. Well, we know that learning is cumulative. And so if you missed, significant areas of access, learning to read, developing your writing skills, developing those math basic and fundamentals, then you can't build on skills that are not there.
Correct.
Because you did not learn them.
And even the behavioral, the social, emotional, behavioral functioning that a lot of school is learning to share and take turns and work collaboratively, a lot of that was also gone throughout the 18 months or so that kids were not in school consistently. So I think that when kids returned in many places, the 21-22 school year, that there was still some social skills delays or immaturity because they did not, again, have the access and opportunity to practice those things as much as they would have if schools were open. So I think academically is an issue. I think the mental health needs, the social, emotional, behavioral functioning, all of it has certainly taken a hit because of where we are. But we must be really intentional about how we understand student functioning as a broader issue in society and really address those things first before getting to the child individually.
Right. And how do we do that? Because we're all entering this system with different levels of understanding of the system. And I think about parents who I sit with all the time, and I think about them navigating the school system and being able to advocate for their child when they may not know how much of this is my child never got the fundamentals because of the disruption due to COVID. They might have a learning disability. This might be a mental health challenge. There's so much special education terminology. There's so many processes. The school system is complex. And when you talk about access, I think about an opportunity. I think about parents who don't even know how to understand the system in order to be able to advocate for what their children need.
Mm-hmm. It's tricky. And I think that a good school system is going to come alongside parents and help them understand all the complexities. But if I can say three things to parents, I would say be present, be proactive, and be persistent. Be present, be proactive, and be persistent. Presence is not only showing up at the school physically, because some parents can't do that due to schedules and jobs and other commitments, but it's your ability to stay in touch with the teacher or the school. So it's calling when you can, it's sending an email when you can, you using Class Dojo or whatever your school system provides, but it's showing the school that you are an active part of your child's education. When I say be proactive, I want families to take the lead in telling the school about their child. I often say, as a psychologist or as an educator, I know all kids, but parents are experts in their own children. So you take the lead to show what they can and cannot do, what their strengths and weaknesses are, because you know them historically over time, especially in the beginning of the school year. Take it the opportunity to really set up a meeting, call, and to share some things that would be helpful for the school to know about your child. And when I say be persistent, that means that you don't take no for an answer. No is sometimes the right answer or sometimes a reasonable response, but it should not be the first response that schools give to parents. If the school starts with no, that's oftentimes the wrong answer. So be persistent in terms of trying to elevate your concerns beyond that person. There's always someone else that you can speak to get another perspective on what you're needing. And having been in schools for 15 years, I do know that there's often a way to compromise and meet somewhere that the family is happy and the school is still doing what they need to do for all students. So be present, be proactive, and be persistent. That's always my advice to families and parents that are advocating for their children.
And I think those are really great points. And particularly when parents might be feeling overwhelmed and feeling that they might not be heard, and maybe even deferring to the teacher and thinking that they must know my child best because they're in class with them all the time, and not realizing that your input and your understanding of your child holds a lot of weight.
Absolutely.
Right? And that you can convey information about your child to the teacher that they may not be aware of, that can have significant impact in terms of how your child is treated at the school and the support that they get.
Absolutely.
And, when I think about that persistence piece, when a parent who thinks their child is really in need of some specialized support that they're not getting. And, I've worked with families who have the ability to hire advocates or hire attorneys when the school says no, that your child doesn't qualify for special education services. And then it brings me back to that issue of access again, right? Access to what do parents do? And again, a lot of that has to do with knowing what your rights are, because so many parents, in situations like that where the school says, no, your child does not qualify for services, that it's up to the parent now to figure out how to provide support that your child needs. But parents might not know they can request another opinion, an independent educational evaluation. but it's so hard for parents to even access that information and because it's not readily available to them. That's one of my struggles with parents. So many parents that come through my office saying, I did not know that I could ask for an independent evaluation because they're not told.
Correct. And I think that one of the things that I talk about in the book is how schools can empower families to be their child's most informed and effective advocate. So we talk about knowledge is power, but before that, it's access to information is key. So how do we inform, equip, empower families with information to tell them this is how you navigate this complex system? Now, telling the family what their rights are does not challenge, my ability to be a school psychologist or even to work for a school system. For me, an informed parent is the most effective parent that we can partner together and really make some good decisions for children. So for your children and for my students. So how do schools really invite families in and just share information about this is who you call, this is what you do if you have a question about whatever process or procedure? It works very well, and it really disarms a lot of the defensiveness that families might come in because they feel that the school has the upper hand with knowledge and power around their children. So I think that schools can do a lot more with inviting, engaging, partnering, sharing power so families can really feel like partners in this whole process for their children.
And that partnership is so important because, parents will say, when I have a good relationship with my child's teacher, it just feels like the outcomes are better. It feels like we're working together to help not only my child but all the children in that classroom. And I think a lot of it too is for the parents and the educators to understand that it's the academic piece. We've been talking about the academic piece, but that social emotional piece that you mentioned as well is so important. And so if you can convey as a parent that my child is feeling anxious, that my child has a low self-concept, something that the teacher may not be aware of, or that might be manifesting in another way behaviorally at school, sharing that information increases understanding on the teacher's part. That this is not a child who just wants to sharpen his pencil 10 times and leave the classroom and is disengaged. There is something else going on.
And I think part of that sharing of knowledge is also teaching families or educating them about there are numerous ways to provide support outside of an IEP or special education. And I don't think parents know that. I think they see my child is having difficulty, they're struggling, it must be a disability, and they must have an IEP. But there's so many things that we can provide through small group counseling or individual counseling outside of the SPED process that families don't know about. And I do think would be very open to their child receiving the help that they need, but it might not require SPED support. So that, again, I think is a point of awareness or education that we can, again, facilitate for families so they are, again, more informed about the process.
Right. And, in talking about anxiety and talking about some of these social emotional factors, it makes me think of something that you argued in your book about, having school-based practitioners embracing a cognitive behavioral approach, which, when I was reading that, I was like, yes, this is so important because of, relationship that we know between a person's thoughts and their behavior. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are these different, ways of approaching therapy or counseling. And one of the ones that's so effective for anxiety and depression and other conditions is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's really, really teaching or reteaching students, children to reframe how they're thinking about themselves or people around them so they can have healthier behavior, healthier coping skills strategies to kind of navigate anxious feelings, anxious thoughts, also depression. I think that when we view counseling not as the therapist or the counselor solving the problem for the client, but really empowering them with strategies that they can use throughout life, then again, we get much more positive outcomes. But even that reframe, I think many people see, well, I'm going to go to my psychologist, my therapist, social worker, and they'll tell me what to do. And that's just not how counseling works. I'm here to partner with you, to equip you with a way of thinking, a way of doing things that's going to be healthier for your life, long term. So CBT is a great approach. It works well in schools. I'll give you a quick example. The child who might be depressed over their latest exam grade in math or science. I was a kid in school who did not like math and was not very good at math. So I get a 50 on my latest math exam. I could take that one exam and think about, I'm never going to college. I'm not smart. I'm not going to amount to anything in life. All these really kind of negative ways of viewing myself. CBT would be a way to reframe that as, well, what are your strengths? You might be good in English. You might be good in history. And what can we do to help you overcome this weakness in math? It could be getting more help. It could be getting more support from a teacher, but really not being so down on yourself because of one exam. Maybe you did great on the last 4 exams, but this one was a bit more challenging. So it really talks about just how do we reframe negative thoughts, perceptions to a much more healthier way of thinking so people can have more productive lives.
Absolutely. And I feel like that cognitive behavioral approach is something that can be incorporated into school instruction in terms of just understanding the relationship between thoughts and behavior and thoughts and emotions, because students often don't make that connection.
Correct.
That it can impact motivation and impact the way that they see themselves and impact their willingness to try things that are hard.
Correct.
And just having that understanding, if you think about, again, empowering individuals with information, it's not just the parents, but in empowering the student with information about their own learning, lets them take ownership over it.
Exactly right. Another one that comes to mind is Carol Dweck's work around growth mindset.
Yes.
And simply just helping students understand that it takes time to improve and to grow towards whatever we're trying to achieve. So I might not be there today, but I'm getting better over time. I'm not where I was last week or last month, last year, but helping them to really just kind of give themselves time and patience to really achieve their goals over the span of a couple of years, even a few months sometimes.
Absolutely, because that can reframe the whole idea of failure.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of not performing well on this particular test, on this particular quiz, or having not mastered a skill yet. Right. There's that opportunity to master it. It may take more time, and that's important to know.
Correct. That word is really, I think, the most important word in growth mindsets, yet. It's, I have not done this yet, or I have not mastered this skill yet. So really helping children to know. I think that in the last probably, 20 years or so, we've gone so far with technology and social media and all these other things that have this instant gratification. And I do think children in this generation have lost the ability to wait for the outcome. If it's not happening now, they feel that I'm never going to get there. And that's just not how life is. So helping them see that I might not be the best at this sport yet, but if I keep working at it, then I'll improve over time.
Right. I mean, the work that you do speaks to so many, again, layers and so many people, to parents, to the student, to educators, to practitioners. There's so much great information in your book, important information. And I'm struck by the disconnect between recognizing a problem exists, the social justice lens, and then doing something about it. What do you want people to do with the information that you have provided them once they read your book or listen to this podcast? What are some things either for the educator, the practitioner, the parent?
Yeah, so I think depending on who reads the book, there are different actions. So if you're an educator, so you're a teacher, you're a school psychologist, you're working in a school, I want you to first be critical of your own work. Think about the concepts and think about how you can embed those concepts in what you do for kids day to day. If it's as a teacher, it's in your instruction, it's in your assessment, in your counseling. Think about how first I can be critical of what I'm doing right now. How can I improve upon my own professional practice? Also, for educators, I want you to now advocate with those who are responsible for setting policy or setting expectations for how you practice. So your director or supervisor, your principal, so that the things that are in the book now become expectations for everyone. What I've learned in my practice is that people do great work in the field of teaching, school psychology, social work, school counseling. But until those are expectations, then we leave it up to people to have their own internal conviction about what's good for kids. So what I want you to do is to take these ideas that are effective and work towards systematizing that across your entire profession, your entire discipline. If you are a family member and you read the book, you're a parent, I want you to start asking questions of your school. And the question to start with is simply, why do we do that versus something else? That's a good place to start. Based on what I learned about, instruction and assessment and things to think about as we're making decisions, does this happen at ABC school? If not, why not? And when you start asking questions, I want you to hold those folks accountable by revisiting that over time. So I think that it's a multi-step process that change certainly, takes time and happens over time. But I want us to start asking questions of our own practice. How do we systemize these practices as now expectations, and then holding people accountable who can make policy decisions based on what we've told them or kind of made them aware of that could be more helpful for children.
Dr. Barrett, if people want to reach you, to connect with you, to learn more, and can even continue this discussion with you, what is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Sure. I'm going to give you three things very, very quickly. My website, www.charlesbarrett.org, Instagram @CharlesABarrett, and Twitter @_CharlesBarrett. So my website, Instagram, or Twitter, my email is charles@charlesbarrett.org. So those are ways to get me very easily, and would love to stay engaged with all of you.
All right. You're about to get a lot of DMs and a lot of emails.
Love it. Love it.
I'm absolutely going to put a link to your book in the show notes because I think it's a must-have for parents, for educators, for practitioners. Dr. Barrett, I can't thank you enough for all the work that you're doing to advocate for policy and systems change in public education and for providing such great resources for professional learning in your book. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
If you'd like to better understand racially and ethnically minoritized students, reflect on and challenge implicit bias in assessment and decision-making, and build meaningful homeschool relationships, be sure to pick up Dr. Barrett's book. The link to where you can pre-order it is in the show notes. Please also reach out to Dr. Barrett at his website, charlesbarrett.org, or via Twitter and Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.